One of my biggest pet peeves was when generative AI kind of hit fever pitch. Everybody thought the database was done. We don't need it anymore because we can point the models at all these unstructured, PDFs and word processing documents.
Welcome to It's About Data, episode 50. We're joined by Andrew Brust of Blue Badge Insights to discuss ontologies, semantics, AI, and the evolution of the Microsoft data ecosystem. Welcome to the conversation here. Really excited to have you. You run Blue Badge Insights. You've been in the big data, Microsoft spaces for a long time, and you also do content for GigaOM on data and analytics. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us some other things that we should know about you?
Sure. Well, that was a pretty good introduction by itself. But yes, I've been doing this stuff a long time. I just got like a little glass award for having been a co-chair of Visual Studio Live for 30 years now, which is frightening. But I've been in the data world and the Microsoft world for a very long time. As a consultant, as a practitioner, as a speaker at conferences, and also as a journalist. And Tony and I have been colleagues in that endeavor before. We both covered data for ZDNet for many, many years. So I went from the consulting world to the analyst world, and sort of in between, I was quoted a lot by tech journalists, and I got tired of just being quoted. So I started doing a lot of writing too. I like both the technology and the business side of the business. And if I can find a fusion of the two and talk some inside baseball, like maybe we'll do today, I'm super happy to do that. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP for the data platform. I've been an MVP for over 20 years at this point.
Wow. And you do your own demos on SQL Server, you were telling us earlier, which is hardcore. I think Bill Gates himself would be reluctant to do demos given some of his experiences.
Well, yeah, except there might be some infrastructure behind him that would make that pretty easy. But yes, I like getting hands-on with stuff. That's for me. I don't think I'm smarter than everyone else. I just think I'm weird because I like working with the tech and I like talking about the business behind the tech. And there is kind of a nice feedback loop between the two. Most people are more interested in one or the other.
Right.
I'm the jack of all trades, master of none, maybe.
Right, but seizing on that point as someone who's been a long time observer, in the Microsoft world, and at one point, with your SQL Server book, you were Mr. SQL Server in New York. What would you say would be like, within recent months, it's been basically the most noteworthy thing to come out of Redmond?
Well, Microsoft Fabric has been the big thing now for a couple of years. And with Microsoft's Ignite show having taken place in November of 25, there were a lot of announcements made there, including around a new kind of slice of fabric. Can fabric be sliced? Mixing metaphors badly already, called Fabric IQ. And Microsoft also announced what they call Work IQ and Foundry IQ, and talk about how those things fit together. But Fabric IQ is interesting because it really sort of brings AI to Fabric and Fabric to AI. And that's important because when Fabric really launched in public preview, it was just in time to be this awesome analytics platform when everyone started talking about generative AI. So it looked like it missed the boat. And now it's sort of putting everything together in a way that I think is pretty rational and good.
Yeah, I would actually kind of share basically your thought there, because actually I wasn't even at Ignite, and yet I saw this announcement of Fabric IQ, and it's been part of sort of kind of a trend that I've been seeing. I mean, initially, start of 2025, I said this was going to be a year for a renaissance of data, and where I see this heading towards in 2026 is kind of like a solidifying formation of semantic spheres of influence. And Microsoft, with Fabric IQ, is really kind of taking some pretty forward steps here. Because can you sort of explain as how you understand Fabric IQ?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, we've talked before offline about how I'm often in my analyst work driven by pet peeves. So, one of my biggest pet peeves was when generative AI kind of hit fever pitch. Everybody thought the database was done. We don't need it anymore because we can point the models at all these unstructured, PDFs and word processing documents, and we don't need databases anymore. And then, of course, by doing that, we saw the output of these models just be, anything from irrelevant to hallucinatory. And now we've kind of come to a more rational place where we understand that, yes, unstructured data can finally be queried, but grounding everything with structured data because it's structured is a good idea. And it actually brings a lot of sanity to this world. But more to the point, it's not just about pointing AI at the columns and tables in your database. It's also about pointing it at your kind of worldview and your vocabulary and your
Yeah.
business context. And, long story short, what that kind of means is having a semantic layer that the model can actually absorb and acclimate to, and thus interpret the natural language queries that it's going to get as something more than general plain English or other language words, and actually understand terms of art where they're used and assign them the significance that they ought to be. And because I'm also a Microsoft Business Intelligence guy going back to the late 90s at the inception of Microsoft BI, I can tell you that Microsoft has always been very, very focused on semantic modeling. In fact, when a kind of second wave of Microsoft SQL Server analysis services came out, they rebranded OLAP cubes as BI semantic models. Even all the way back then, this is roughly 20 years ago.
Well, like with
So
Business Objects Universe,
right. Well,
same idea.
that's actually the birthplace of it. But the whole point is that a dimensional model for BI and a semantic model for AI are pretty close. They're not exactly the same, though. So the good news is that the semantic models that came from Power BI into Fabric have been very good for grounding AI,
Mm.
but they're really geared towards dimensional reporting, i.e.,
Yeah.
slicing and dicing, taking numbers and then slicing those numbers by categories, right? And by the way, what I just did was explain BI without using the vocabulary designed to keep people out. But the numbers, if you hear measures mentioned, that's what those numbers are, and the categories are dimensions. So that's great, and that works for a certain kind of analysis. It really doesn't work for the full universe of natural language query. So what Microsoft has done is to try and say, look, we have the semantic model that we have this thing we call a semantic model, which is really a dimensional model. Now we need a more modern, broader semantic model, and they've added that, and that's what they're calling an ontology, because I can't really call it a semantic model. They already have something with that name. And what they're also doing is saying in that ontology, we're not just bringing in entities and describing them and putting in their properties. We're also going to be very kind of rigorous about letting people describe the relationships between those entities. And then, in addition to that, if you're into the tech on this, use a graph engine in the
Yep.
background so that when people ask kind of questions that might look arcane, like I want to see my total revenue for 2024 from I don't know, from customers who have branch offices in Kazakhstan. I'm being kind of esoteric on purpose, right? That relationship needs to be the relationship part of that query needs to be translated into some kind of graph query language and executed with a graph engine. And as a user, you don't want to bother with saying, all right, well,
No.
I know there's a graph engine for this and a relational engine for that and a BI engine for that. And I'm going to pick the best thing pick the right tool for the right job. If AI is doing anything, it is saying you don't have to pick the best tool for the
Right.
best job anymore. The model will pick the best tool for the job just give us your query, and then we'll kind of orchestrate which components of that query should be marshaled where. And IQ is largely about that. It brings in a graph engine. It brings in an ontology. It takes the data agent that was already in Fabric, but really makes it more formally part of this part of the platform. It brings in a new kind of agent called operations agent, and then it ties it all into the real-time parts of Fabric that have been a little bit off to the side, these things called event houses, and so forth, so that not only can we query kind of historic data that's in the lake, but we can also query real-time streaming data and basically kind of stitch it all together. And by the way, stitching, weaving, Fabric, those are not coincidental kind of vocabulary overlaps, right?
Right. Right. Well, and it's funny with ontology, like ontology is really hot right now.
Yeah.
And yet you also see people running around on LinkedIn in the comments saying, oh, well, just ask ChatGPT to generate your ontology. It's like that defeats the entire point. The goal is not to create some generic ontology that doesn't apply to your business. The goal is to understand what the hell is going on inside your business from people who
Yeah.
actually know that.
I think the demonization of structure is silly because
Right.
business is largely structured. So as
Right.
long as those structures exist, and by the way, they're great at mitigating hallucinations because they bring in context and they bring in, I don't know, boundaries, if you will.
Yeah.
As long as those things exist, give them to the model. The model sops that stuff up like a sponge. It loves it. And then you can get really, I think, a lot more productive with AI rather than just being impressed that, a fairly inarticulate question about your data actually comes back with an answer, right? If we want to get beyond the coolness of that, which is basically cool demos, and get to the point where it's productionalized and works for the enterprise, then we need to do things like this.
Right.
Well,
Go ahead, Tony.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, and this, Matt, from both of our experiences this year, we had someone an expert on ontologies. I don't know if Andrew, if you know Jessica Talisman. We had her on the summer. It was when my internet went out. I got exactly one question in the whole discussion, but that podcast just blew up. I think we must have gotten about 20,000 views, which at the time was a record for us. Matt and I were also at Data Day Texas back last winter. And the whole message that we coming out of there is that everybody's looking for context. And to me, what's really interesting is that there have been, outside of your process modeling tools that we've had all these years, which are just kind of static and just kind of speak to more of a 1990s kind of knowledge management idea, that there's really, now, this is where I think, to me, what made an impression with Fabric IQ was just how they jumped into ontology and helped to put this into kind of like a low code, no code, type of experience. There really are very few tools out there. And I mean, for what Fabric IQ has with the semantic layer, as you say, Andrew, BI semantics have been around for years, but they added this ontology. And so the last question I want to ask you on this segment basically is, what do you think, how are users going to adopt this? Where do you think that users and Microsoft are going to go with this?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean by users, but I think really the idea is that the data engineers and the architects are the ones who can build the ontologies, and the users just get to benefit from them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to disparage users as saying like they can't put ontologies together, because I think users who are motivated to do that can probably do a really good job at it. But the point is that people who are good at infrastructure should be able to build the infrastructure, which should then improve the quality of the AI. And then again, end users don't need to concern themselves with the subtleties of all these layers, right? That should, it's infrastructure is the whole thing about infrastructure is that you don't think about it, right?
Yeah.
The electrical grid, the gas lines coming into your house, you take them for granted. So the most successful infrastructure is the infrastructure you take for granted, and not the kind you have to build yourself. And we're evolving to that point. That's what's exciting. And the exciting part of AI, and by the way, the whole thing with IQ, if you go all the way up to Foundry IQ, is that it can orchestrate. It actually uses Azure AI Search, which once upon a time was called Cognitive Search, and it can orchestrate across the work IQ stuff, which is really Office, and underneath it, the Office graph, right? Or Microsoft 365, as they prefer to call Office today, and Fabric IQ to be able to query the whole data estate. And so that's the idea: is get the infrastructure in place. Don't make the dumb mistake of saying the infrastructure doesn't matter anymore. It matters a ton. It's critical, but end users shouldn't have to think about it. They should just be able to benefit from it.
Yeah, the problem I see right now is that for ontologies have actually been around for a long time. They're famously used, I think, still used at Google for search because they work extremely well for
Right.
trying to figure out what people are looking for. But I think for most companies, there's kind of a cold start problem, right? Like there just aren't enough trained ontologists or data engineers who know anything about ontology. Where do you think the industry should go to solve that cold start problem? How do we get the training? How do we get the skills out there to do this?
So again, hopefully there should be a one-to-many kind of benefit graph for that. So that skill set shouldn't need to be, mainstream per se. But really, a lot of it is aligned with the BI background and skill set and mindset, which is, again, just doing things dimensionally where you have measures and dimensions. That's not the end all be all, but it does help you think about, taking all of the data and being somewhat reductionist about it, so that you instead of seeing an untaxonomized, unhierarchical field of tables and columns, you actually start to see those things as things to query and other things to cross reference them with. And once you've been able to kind of bring in that frame of reference, then the data becomes a lot more navigable. So I would say that folks who are good at being sort of BI engineers, or at least you don't even need to be an engineer per se, you just need to be somebody motivated to kind of like want the engineering to be there so that you can ask those kinds of questions and get them answered. That's, you can have a self-interested motivation for this, and if you do, then you can build these ontologies well. And by the way, you can generate a fabric ontology from a semantic model. The idea is that that's just a start. That's an on-ramp, right? Then you go into the ontology and you embellish it with lots of other stuff, including these rules that will do things in real time, that will enable agents to make decisions and action things in real time. All that stuff is in there. The ontologies have a way to go though, because until they can handle things like synonyms, and I guess a deeper sense of how all of these business terms interact, then they're not full ontologies properly so called. And the thing that's a little frustrating to me is that Power BI had the ability to establish verbal relationships and synonyms in the semantic models since way back when. And then along came these agents and they kind of disregarded that. And Microsoft does need to get its house in order to take all the semantic linguistic stuff that you could do in Power BI and somehow make sure that the ontologies, first of all, achieve parity with that, and then hopefully go further.
Yeah. Andrew, I was about to congratulate you, but I think you just blew it, because I think we went for almost 15 minutes without mentioning agents. But you know something? I think that's probably part of our next discussion, which we'll have to have, coming back with this, because the thing is obviously lurking in the background in terms of, how we use ontology, how it makes it useful. There's this thing called agents, which is probably going to multiply the attack area. Anyway, Andrew, thanks for taking time to enlighten us about Fabric IQ. Interesting stuff.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Talk to you later.